Hello and welcome. I'm so glad to have you all back with us for another session of On Book. On behalf of the staff and the board and the artists of the Old Globe Theater, I want to welcome you to our online Shakespeare Reading Club. This week, we're going to really kick off our discussion of the Taming of the Shrew. We're going to be talking about the play for probably the next 3 weeks total, at least this week, the next, and probably a portion of the third week, the following week. I want to say thank you to those of you who've shared some information about yourselves in the group, about who you are and why you're here and what you're interested in doing in this group, and what's most helpful to you. And people have been asking me how much of the play they should have read at different times by this session, by the next session. And there's not really a set amount. This week, what I'll start doing is posting some threads for discussion in the group. And this week, I'll try to focus our questions on Acts 1 and 2. The following week, I'll focus questions on Acts 3 and 4. And then on the following week, we'll do questions that cover the whole play, including the ending. But that said, it's pretty fluid. I mean, it's fine if you've read the whole play already. I mean, basically, read it at your own pace. Our guests will probably talk about the whole play. So at any point, you'll be able to talk about the whole play with them. And speaking of guests, I'm very excited to welcome this week Director Shauna Cooper. Let me see if I can get her on here through the wonders of technology. Ta-da! It worked.
Hi.
Hello, Shauna. Welcome.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everybody.
As I said last week, please let us know in the chat as you guys are watching it. If for some reason something isn't, you're not able to hear us, you're not able to see us, just let us know. We'll keep sort of wrestling this technology into submission. And if we fall out or if we lose connection, we'll record a video offline and post it afterwards, as we said last week. So Shauna is scheduled to direct the Taming of the Shrew in the Globe's Outdoor Theater. She, in addition to her extensive work on new plays, which she does frequently, she has directed plenty of Shakespeare during her career. Some of the titles I pulled off her resume were Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet, Love's Labour's Lost, Twelfth Night, Richard III, and 2 previous productions of Taming of the Shrew. Is that right, Shauna?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, this one's sticking with me.
Well, maybe that's a good place to start. This is a play that you're coming back to direct for the 3rd time. What drew you to the Taming of the Shrew as a director? Well, perhaps we should start, like, one of the things that I mentioned was that people might not have read the whole play yet. So could you tell us maybe give us a 30-second overview of the play from your point of view? Is that something that's possible for you to do?
Oh my gosh, Danielle. I mean, this is the thing about this play, right? Is it depends so heavily on point of view, more so in my experience than almost any other Shakespeare play in terms of just like, what is the story? What is the story you're telling? And oftentimes I feel like, and even with this play, I actually feel that the story is what it is on this page, but how people have interpreted this particular story through time radically changes what the story is. So I guess I would say, as an entry point, part of how you answer that question is to start with a kind of uber question, which is this a misogynistic play, or is this a play about misogyny, which I feel like is a kind of Richter scale that people vacillate on, and depending on where they land on that scale, they may radically sort of articulate what the story is differently. And I think if you were someone who felt like it is inherently a misogynistic play, there is a version of this story that is this, sort of strong-willed woman, Kate, who is tamed by a man and by society to become a submissive wife. And then there's a version of this play, which is the version that I would say I believe Shakespeare wrote, which is that it is a play partly about misogyny, but I would say it's a romantic comedy about misogyny. I don't even know if that is like, can you do that? But Shakespeare did that. And I say that because I think it's a satire, which is really important to remember, that there is a status quo. It's a play set in a patriarchal world in which men have all the power, women are commodified. Really, the only way towards agency in this world for women is through marriage. It's a very commercial, kind of wealthy, superficial world in which like clothes make the man or woman, and there's a really strict, limited definition of what it means to be a woman, what beauty means, what behaviors women are entitled to exhibit, all of those things. And so all things I think you could say are, part of a patriarchal society, an extreme one, given the world of this play. But it's also a world of clowns. And so I think through the style, you feel the way in which it is actually a clown show about the patriarchy, not a realistic treatise on the, patriarchy in terms of the playwright's view. And then within that, there's this kind of revolutionary love story, I feel, between Kate and Petruchio, two people who are fiercely individualist, and kind of fearless and relentless in their vulnerability and individuality and bravery to be themselves in a more commercial world. And they have, I think, through the connection and love that they find with each other, they decide to do the risky, messy, challenging thing of trying to create a new way of living and loving and being in the world.
So do you remember the first time you read The Taming of the Shrew? Do you remember what you thought about it when you first encountered it? And has that opinion changed as you've worked on it so much?
It has. I saw it as a kid, actually, at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where I grew up in Ashland. And there's a big Shakespeare Festival there. I think I saw it when I was 8 or 9, and I really liked it at the time. I liked the sort of wildness and ferocity of play that exists between Kate and Petruchio and the wooing scene. And I remember being entertained by it. But then I read it I really probably read the play for the first time as an adult when I was asked to direct it at Cal Shakes in the Bay Area, California Shakespeare Theater. The artistic director said, "Would you be interested in directing this play?" And I read it and I hated it. And I said no. And I said no, I think multiple times. And he finally convinced me that I had to direct it. And so I said yes, but I actually just really wrestled with the play the entire design period. And it wasn't until I got into the room with the actors. And then they were so funny. And I finally started to understand the clowning nature of the satire and the way in which you can interrogate these uncomfortable, problematic truths about our society. But he's doing it in such, through kind of embracing the ridiculousness of those things when pushed to an extreme. And if you have incredible actors doing it, which we do for our production at the Old Globe, it's really funny. It's just genius comedic writing. And then within that, you get this just very unique, I think, modern love story. And so in that way, when I finally rehearsed it that first time around, it became one of my favorite plays. And I haven't been able to stop working on it. I never get tired of it. I actually, because I feel like it's about these questions that we're still really wrestling with as a society. So it feels so vital and important and just critical to the social, our sort of forward movement as a human race right now, these questions about gender and power and how we evolve the conversation. And then at the same time, I think that Kate and Petruchio journey is sort of undeniably moving and funny and quirky and, ultimately just like I'm a diehard romantic. And at the end, I mean, this is again about interpretation, right? But I kind of feel like they get to escape the challenges of the status quo and they start to build a new world together.
That's so interesting. Can you remember when you read it, the things that you hated about it the first time? Was it just the sort of patriarchy of it? Were there other specific things you were like, that character is dumb and I hate that character?
Well, I think part of it was like, why all the clowns? I think I hadn't connected the fact that, what satire does is take a social or political issue and interrogate it through humor. And I think because I didn't quite get the humor on the page, I think it really does require genius comedic actors. And so until I saw it translated through that, it just felt like the clowning kind of felt arbitrary. And then the like part of the play that if you don't understand that Shakespeare's interrogating misogyny can just actually feel like it's misogynistic in terms of like how the Kate and Petruchio relationship works, the way that everyone treats Bianca, the fact that women are sold to the highest bidder, all these things. You're like, why do I want to work on this play? But the thing is that once it's funny, you start to feel the radical political voice inside the play. It's legitimately funny. And then I understood the purpose to the clowning. And so it no longer felt arbitrary. It felt like, oh, there's a real mission to this humor. And then, I think the Kate and Petruchio journey, quite honestly, takes a close read. Like there's a lot of baggage that we have about this play that I think audiences, actors, everybody, I did when I first read it, that it's easy to gloss the specifics of like, what is the argument that like Petruchio is actually making when he's trying to tame her, and what are the beat by beat moments that happen between them that evolve that relationship, and why is he doing the things that he's doing, and the spontaneity with which he's trying to figure out how to make this relationship work. And I think he makes a lot of mistakes along the way, no question. But I think it's hard to change the status quo when you're also a product of that status quo without making some major mistakes along the way. And I think once I understood that and started to see how Shakespeare was giving us a protagonist with Petruchio who was really advocating for a break from this more superficial world in which only beauty was valued, and encouraging Kate to be herself, but also like say thank you, and that's fair. Like you can say, how are you going to create a long-term relationship with someone if you can't work from a place of like basic human kindness? And she can't at the time the play begins because she's been so kind of wounded by the society at large.
So every time you've done the play 3 times, have you approached it the same way every time? Have you sort of like, or have you radically reimagined how you've approached it each time? And how would you describe your approach to the play that you're taking here at the Globe?
Yeah, I would say every time I come into contact with it, it evolves a bit. The first time I did it, it was 2011. The second time I did it, it was 2018, right after the fall of 2017, which was like the fall that all the Me Too movement stuff exploded. So the world radically changed. And these plays are so in response to our world. And Shakespeare was such a, so ahead of his time in many ways in terms of, and deep in terms of the things he was exploring about who we are and how we have built our societies and how we operate within them, that when the world changes, your reading of these plays completely changes. So, I think that 2018 production, it was a really raw time to be working on the play. It was hard, I would say, to build it because I think the women in the cast, myself included, were sensitive, I think to these topics in a more kind of raw way. It felt much more high stakes, but at the same time, because of that, it felt so critical to be telling the story. And then I think right now, one of the things I keep thinking about with it is like coming out of this time where we've all been alone, and the importance of joy and the importance of laughter right now, and like humor. And so those parts of the play, I think right now, it's not that the politics goes away, but I feel like that to me feels like a lifeline, and that we have to elicit joy and humor and love, as much of that as possible in the play, alongside the politics, but and the questions of gender and power and all of those things. But I feel like we're all so hungry for that right now.
Yeah. I want to invite folks who are watching to please post your questions. We'll take them certainly at the end. But if you have questions that you want to ask, please throw them up there in the chat and we will come over to them and answer them. One of the questions that came out of our last session was about this odd, as we're sort of like beginning our reading of the play, this odd beginning, the way that the play starts. It starts with this frame story, right? This induction where we have a man who is being tricked into thinking he's a lord, and they put on a play for him. And some of the people were asking in our chat last time, like, what's that? Like, why is that there?
Totally.
And is that something that you are wrestling with in your production? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's, one of the big ones you have to look at when you're working on this play. And I think when there's something like that in a Shakespeare play that I don't understand, which I didn't at first with the induction, I had this gut impulse of like, why is that there? Christopher Sly, who cares? Let's get to the meat of the story. But the challenge I always give to myself is like, you have to figure out what Shakespeare is doing. This is a genius writer. You cannot just cut something until you know why it's there and what purpose it serves. And so as I wrestled with that question, what became clear to me is it seems like some important things about the Christopher Sly frame is that it sets up the story of the taming of the shrew and Kate and Petruchio in the world of Padua as a fable that is being told to teach someone something. And so that does two things. One, it's not real. It's a story, right? So to this idea of satire, it to me implicitly suggests that the writer is not writing realism. So for us to read again these clowns or Padua, that world as a realistic world that somehow the playwright is advocating for, which I think sometimes people make that assumption. It's inherently a story that is being told to teach someone something. Now, you can debate about what that is, but I think the fact that it is a fable in some way speaks to the satirical nature for me. The fact that we're meant to learn something from this journey feels important. And for me, that's more about like breaking open, what our, breaking open these questions for ourselves about gender and power and the limited structures we've created within our societies, and how if we start to dismantle them, they make our own, personal relationships richer and deeper and more complex. But you can take any number of things away from this play, but that Shakespeare intended us to take a lesson of some kind, and then that there's a frame of some sort feels important in order to achieve that. So I still ended up cutting the Christopher Sly story because that seemed important to cut it and figure out a different way to create a frame that could help us launch our specific story. And what that became for me is a movement-driven piece that's really interrogating questions about gender and power and gender and performance. And that's been, the challenge for us. So we work with this choreographer, Erica Chong-Shook, and just explore these questions of like the binary nature of Taming of the Shrew, the way in which it's a world in which men are men, women are women. There doesn't seem to be room for something in between. And that gender in a way is a performance across the board for everybody and in this world. And so we like kind of bird's eye view with that induction land us in a world in which those are the given circumstances. And then from there, and the truths of, the world at large. And from there we zero into these specific characters and the journey that they go on to wrestle with those truths.
So you're including an induction, but perhaps not Shakespeare's induction.
That's right. That's exactly right.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
As a director, so a lot of people, I think, when they start to read Shakespeare's plays, they're encountering this language, maybe for the first time, maybe again after a long absence from the language, and having to sort of wrestle with it a little bit as a reader. How do you approach Shakespeare's language as a director? How do you engage with this foreign language that is also English that we understand, but maybe we don't really understand it. What's your approach to it as a director?
I mean, I feel that the plays he wrote are so personal and so deeply about our own humanity. So I really want the language to like live as muscularly and viscerally as possible. And I feel like he requires all of us as performers and artists when we're, you know, trying to meet that language, and he creates like extraordinary arguments. And if you follow the argument of any given character, you can really track through the language, I think, in a more accessible way. Like if you're actually trying to read it on the page, that can be a helpful way to try to follow it, is just thinking about this idea of like, what is the argument the character is making? Because he really does write that way. It's rhetorical writing. And I think once I understood that, that helped me just get on language in a way. And then, you know, the poetry of it, I had this Shakespeare professor when I was in grad school who would talk about poetry as a need for clarity. Mm-hmm. And so there's a way in which if a character has, the deeper and more dense the poetry is, the deeper their need for clarity is. And so if you can think about activating it in that way, it makes it, again, human and purposeful, not just poetry for the sake of poetry.
One of the questions that's coming up in the chat, I don't see it on my sideline, but I see it on my screen over here, is whether we approach the text differently. Because we talked a little bit with Abe Stoll last week about how the texts are usually cut. So creating a text for performance is about engaging with Shakespeare's text and creating perhaps a shorter version of it. I don't know how long is Taming of the Shrew. How have you approached cutting it? And have you edited out? The question is, has Shauna edited out different parts of the play in response to the times in which she has directed it? So have you created different cut versions for different productions?
Totally. I mean, holistically, the main thing I've done is like cut the induction. We have this movement-driven induction. And then I would just say streamlined and tightened a few scenes. And mostly the reason I do that is because we only have so much time to work on these plays. And if you compress the text a little bit, you can work more deeply on a slightly smaller amount of text, is truly the only reason I do that. But I have made a few word changes in this particular play. I did it for the first time this last time I directed the play in 2018, because coming off the heels of the Me Too discoveries, there were a few moments in that final speech that Kate has that were hard to reconcile. Mm-hmm. And I actually believe that the overall argument of that speech as written actually is an argument about the power in true vulnerability and fully abandoning yourself to another human being, which I think is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And the fact that Kate articulates it in public and makes that offer in public is a very powerful thing to do, actually. But there are a couple, and that she's a lot talking about her doing it as a woman because she is a woman, right? But that there is inherently in that speech a proposal that this is what one can and should do in a relationship if you can find the sort of emotional fortitude to. But I think written, it's hard to not hear it as purely directed at the women. Mm-hmm. So I found that if I changed just a few pronouns, and I'll leave it to you all to figure out which those might be, it just shifted it a little bit to make the argument about all people and not just women. But I would say I changed like 5 pronouns and 1 word. And I think if you can change that little in what is like a 2.5-page speech and get at what the argument was that I just articulated, my thought is that is probably the original intent of the speech.
Interesting.
But of course, none of us know for sure.
A couple of more comments that are coming across. One, an observation. Richard says he observes that in reading the play, I was struck at how often Petruchio compliments Kate when almost every other character disparages her.
Yes.
And that's interesting. In the language of the play, it's a really smart observation.
It is. And so it's things like that where you have to go. Now, you can make the argument that sometimes he's being sincere and sometimes he's not. But if he's being sincere even a fraction of the time, that's more than anyone else has ever said to her. And what is it to be a woman who has only been insulted and scorned and talked down to and berated, and have someone come in and call you beautiful and say you're well-spoken and say all of these things that no one has ever said to her before? It's important to recognize the gift of that.
It's interesting. There's a couple of questions coming across, and I'm thinking about as we look at the first few acts of the play. This one says, is there a scene in the play that shows that the older sister, which I'm assuming we're talking about Kate here, is unhappy in the society? And I'm wondering about how that, when I hear that question, I wonder about what your take is on how the characters are introduced. Like how they're introduced as individuals and how their first meeting is introduced, and how have you wrestled with that on stage as a director? Or what do you think when you're showing that scene the first time we see Kate, the first time Petruchio and Kate meet? What are some of the things that you've thought are important to sort of show about those meetings? Is it that she's unhappy in the society? Is it that what are we sort of needing to get from when we see them in those scenes?
I mean, given what she says in the first, two scenes that we meet her and sort of what we hear about her offstage action, I suppose, if we can trust the people who are reporting on it, she seems pretty unhappy. She's like, she doesn't really have a whole lot of great things to say about anyone.
What are those actions and those scenes that you're talking about?
I mean, she in the first scene with the suitors and her father, she hurls insults at everyone on stage. All the suitors, her sister, her father. And then and then the second scene, she's fighting with her sister and she physically attacks her. And then when her father comes, and then her sister seems to do a bit of emotional manipulation. And then her father comes in, and when he chides her, she says, basically, I see, you love her. Like she is your favorite. She will, I can't remember what the line is exactly, but I will dance barefoot on her wedding day, and for your love to her lead apes to hell, which basically means like die an old maid. I will go sit and weep till I can find occasion for revenge. And the truth is that Kate, I think there's 2 times in the play where in the language it says she cries, but there are at her wedding when Petruchio doesn't show up. She's the only character in the play who cries. So you have to, in the text, like based on what the text says. So it's just interesting, like there's clearly a lot of pain there in addition to the rage that is articulated in the language. So those 2 things speak to, I think, an unhappiness at her core, I would argue. But the other choice we've made, there's this sort of myth that goes along with the play sometimes of like this Kate makeover journey in which she starts the play like a disaster in terms of dress. And then by the end, she's looking glamorous and fabulous. And Austa, the costume designer, and I started to just talk about both the prison and the goal that something like female fashion can become, and that it felt too easy to just be like, oh, she's opted out of it, or is not interested in it. And so we made the decision that to have her as kind of trapped in the fashion of the world as everyone else is, but at the same time also like secretly longing to succeed in that way and be beautiful in that way, and be kind of yearning for that in that way, so that when Petruchio makes the argument first at the wedding, and then when he takes her home, that none of this matters, like the trappings of this world shouldn't matter to you, and that he has this extraordinary speech once they go back to his house. What is the jay more precious than the lark, because its feathers are more beautiful? No, my Kate, neither are you the worse because of this mean apparel that she's wearing. Now that's after he's torn the dress apart in front of her that they ordered for her. So, like, that's where I say there are mistakes made along the way, but I think what he recognizes in her is in fact a yearning for some of the things that are considered beautiful in the society that she has been told she's not worthy of. And what he's trying to teach her is, oh, you're worthy of that, but you're worthy of so much more. And like, let's dream up a world in which none of that actually matters. And that's not how you value yourself or how others value you. And I think that's the more kind of miraculous place that they get to together by the end of the play.
Oh, well, speaking of the end of the play, we had a comment here. I can put this one on the screen. Whoa. That last scene to me is about trust. She puts her hand on his foot. It's hope and expectation that he won't trot on it. Trust is the basis for healthy relationships.
I totally agree.
So that sounds like to the journey that you're speaking to, the development of each other's, belief in your own worth and belief in the trust in a relationship with another person.
Totally. And how sad is it that we live in a world, in part because of what the world has been built as, that for a woman to exhibit complete trust publicly is seen as weakness or meekness, not strength. And that's why I would argue in, power of vulnerability, and the fact that she is able to do that publicly is a moment at which Petruchio, and I would say the entire world at that wedding, recognizes that she is seeing further and deeper and is capable of more courage than anyone else in the play, including Petruchio. And I think he witnesses that. He's more silent during that speech than he is any other time in the play. And I think he's speechless because of her,
Well, as we come sort of to the end of this session, I just would like to ask you as we close, like, what tips or advice would you have for people in the group who are reading the play, maybe for the first time, maybe coming to it again with some excitement or trepidation?
Yeah.
What tips would you have for people to have the most enjoyable experience with the play that they can?
I think with this play, as much as you can, try to rehear the play. Like, we talk about this in rehearsal sometimes, because in the word rehearsal, which we do obviously when we're building a production, is the smaller phrase rehear. And I think with these plays that we think we know so well and that carry a lot of baggage, like I think Taming of the Shrew can, to actually try to rehear what is actually being said, not what is being said interpreted through photos of other productions you've seen or other productions of the play you've actually seen, or what the current news is, but like what is actually being said in the play, and then how does that resonate with your own life. I think this play is a really personal one, and so it's a beautiful story to read, because I would venture to say probably everyone can relate to it in some way. It's about both coming into your own as an individual and also in a marriage and in a relationship. So depending on where you are in life, you may connect to any one of those things, but I think it holds something for everyone.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to be back in the group on Thursday at the same time, 2 p.m. Pacific. We're going to have John Tufts with us, one of the actors. And we're going to talk maybe a little bit about clowns and clowning and how those characters function in the play. So I want to say thank you, Shauna, for joining us. Thank you for everyone for watching. And we'll see you again Thursday at 2 p.m.
Okay, wonderful. Great to see you all. Thank you. Take care. Bye.